Good morning, it's Thursday the 7th of May. I'm Marit Gwyn and you're watching Europe Today, your daily dose of morning news and analysis live here on Euronews. Coming up today, EU negotiators failed to reach an agreement on the bloc's trade deal with the US in late-night talks here in Brussels. Talks could resume on May the 19th. Pressure is mounting after President Trump threatened to hike tariffs on EU cars to 25%, a move that would be in breach of the deal. And oil prices have fallen amid reports Iran and the US are closing in on a deal to end the war. But Washington and Tehran have offered conflicting reports on the state of negotiations. We speak to the US's former ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, about the conflict and its implications for the transatlantic alliance. Also, 3 people are being evacuated to Europe from the cruise ship at the centre of a deadly Hantavirus outbreak. The ship is sailing towards the Canary Islands after the Spanish government gave permission for it to dock, despite the regional governments there rejecting the request. We'll have more details on that story too. But first, to our top story this morning, EU diplomats, officials and lawmakers failed to give their final approval to the bloc's trade deal with the US during talks which stretched late into the night here in Brussels. The delay risks adding to the frustration of President Trump, who has, of course, threatened to hike tariffs on EU cars to 25%. For more, we can bring in our trade reporter, Peggy Corlan. Good morning, Peggy.
Good morning.
So no deal on implementing this agreement still. Tell us more.
No deal. Yesterday night, EU lawmakers and EU member states didn't find an agreement to cut EU tariffs on US goods to 0%, as agreed in the Hantavirus agreement. Let me remind you what this Hantavirus agreement is about. Last year, after weeks of trade disputes, the EU and the US agreed that they would impose US tariff at 15% on EU goods and that the EU would cut its tariff at 0%. So yesterday night, the Parliament's lead negotiator, the German MEP Bernd Lange, wanted to attach conditions to the deal. The core objective was to shield the deal from future US threats, like the one made last week over EU cars or like the one made a couple of months ago over Greenland. And the Parliament also wanted to make the deal temporary, which means expiring in March 2028, a couple of months before the end of Trump's mandate.
OK, and Peggy, I think we can also take a listen to what Maroš Šefčovič, the trade chief, who, of course, has been urging this deal to get over the line, had to say in Paris last night.
We have to deliver on what was promised in Scotland, meaning lowering the tariffs for the US exports to European Union, as we agreed in our joint statement. And of course, for me, it's also very important that United States would live up to the expectations and also would live up to what was agreed to the infirmary. And I'm talking here about return to 15% all-inclusive tariff, which was agreed up.
And Peggy, we know that EU capitals governments are part of these talks. What are they saying?
Well, EU governments consider that the Parliament's demands go too far. But the diplomats I talked to yesterday night told me that there could be room for compromise. But it's too early. Yesterday night was about presenting each side's political line, and technical negotiations will come at a future stage for next round of negotiations. EU capitals here are trying to balance 2 objectives. One, which is to avoid any move that would reinforce Trump's narrative, which is to say that the EU does not honor the deal, the Hantavirus agreement, and at the same time protect the agreement from future US threat. So here there's room for compromise with the Parliament, which pursues the same goal.
OK, Peggy, thank you so much for that comprehensive update. We'll be keeping an eye on developments in the coming weeks, of course. Now, moving on, after 2 months of conflict, it appears that the US and Iran are closing in on a one-page, 14-point memo to end the war. Reports suggest the deal could include a moratorium on nuclear enrichment and the easing of some sanctions on Iran. A key question is when the Strait of Hormuz can fully reopen. But the war has already put transatlantic ties under immense strain. our correspondent Shona Murray caught up with the former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, and started by asking him about his assessment of the prospects of a deal.
It seems like there will be a mutually agreed opening of the Strait of Hormuz, so shipping can go in and out. There'll be an end to fighting, and there'll be a moratorium on uranium enrichment and a nuclear program with inspections. Those seem to be the outlines, probably also lifting of sanctions and returning funds to Iran. This is actually very, very similar to what was already in the JCPOA that was torn up. The differences, if there are any, and if what we read in the press is to be believed, are that we've destroyed most of Iran's power projection capability. So it'll take them a while to restore that.
Which is what the JCPOA would have done if it had been able to continue after 2017.
Right. Well, that would have expired, I believe, in 2018.
They could have renegotiated. I mean, the path of the JCPOA, the years before it took to negotiate that as well.
Yeah, in that sense, yes. So we are basically back where we were and achieving pretty much the same thing.
So what can Donald Trump say that he achieved, particularly given the death toll? When we saw 170 young schoolgirls killed on the first day of this war. I mean, then also other, obviously, civilian casualties, and a regime still intact after it killed its own people back in January, which was actually the reason why this particular conflict started in the first place.
There are many reasons why this conflict was there, and the reasons kept shifting. Sometimes President Trump referred to the protesters or the 45,000 people, as he said, killed. I'm not sure the number was quite that high, but a large number of people killed by the regime. Other times it was the nuclear program. Other times it was ballistic missiles. But what I think he can say he achieved is setting Iran back, both in terms of its military, its power projection capability, its proxies, and its nuclear program. All of that is physically set back substantially. But as you say, the regime does stay in place, and it does have the capability and the will to shut down shipping in the Persian Gulf if it wants to.
And the issue is, though, that with the Strait of Hormuz, although it had been gamed that the Iranians could take control of it in the event of a war like this, they have institutionalized it now, the Iranians. They've sort of they know now that they can control this, turn it on and off as they like in the future.
Yeah, that's right. And also the business model of the Gulf states of being a secure and relatively free place to do business globally is shaken a bit by the fact that Iran has shown a willingness to fire missiles and drones at them. So that's going to take some time to restore confidence there as well. So in a way, the Iranian regime comes out of this emboldened, even though they have been substantially weakened.
What do you think this means for NATO? We saw the US president abruptly announce the withdrawal of 5,000 troops because we haven't seen any strategy since from the Pentagon in relation to that.
Let's put these into a couple of different categories. The first is President Trump's peak at NATO countries for not fighting alongside the U.S. in the Persian Gulf. That's really, I think, a distraction. He never asked them to. There was no consultation. There was no agreement on a common plan. It was just a venting saying, well, you're not there for us, even though we're there for you. I don't think that is something we should take too seriously from a military point of view, but rather it is just a further reflection of President Trump's general unhappiness with NATO countries. Then you get to specific complaints about we were not able to use bases in Spain. We were not able to use bases in Italy. Germany said some nasty things about us. And so we're going to take some military steps. Well, there, I think we do have to take it seriously. President Trump is indeed unhappy and wants to take some steps. But then we have to look at what the U.S. military wants to do. The presence of U.S. forces in Europe is good for the United States.
Ambassador Kurt Volker speaking to Shona Murray there. Now, 3 people with suspected Hantavirus are being evacuated from the cruise ship linked to the deadly outbreak of the virus. 3 people have already died on the Dutch-flagged ship known as MV Hondius. The ship is now on its way to the Canary Islands. For more details on this story, I'm joined by our health reporter, Marta Iraola. Good morning, Marta. bring us up to speed, remind us the story of this cruise ship.
Good morning. Yeah, we're talking about a luxury cruise ship that took off Argentina the 1st of April, carrying approximately like 150 passengers. It has since then crossed the Atlantic, making some stops in the Sandwich Islands in Santa Elena until it arrived to Cabo Verde. Cabo Verde was the original destination of the ship. However, at the beginning of April, some people started to feel sick in what it has now been confirmed as an outbreak of Hantavirus, a rare rodent disease. Since then, there have been 8 infected passengers. 3 of them have died. Some others are being treated in the hospital, and the 3 are being evacuated to the Netherlands.
Okay, and now what do we know about the fate of the remaining passengers of this ship?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, the ship is now on its way to the Canary Island, where it's set to arrive this weekend on Saturday to Tenerife. The passengers will likely disembark on Monday and will from there be taken to their own countries, where they will be put in quarantine. This decision of taking the ship to the Canary Island has raised some tensions between the local government and the national government of Spain. Here is Fernando Clavijo, who was here in Brussels and was talked about this topic.
Our technical position is that if the passengers are healthy, there is no risk of transmission. It makes no sense for them to have to travel to the Canary Islands to be repatriated. They can easily do so at the Cape Verde International Airport. If we are truly considering the best interests of these passengers and ensuring they can return home to put an end to this nightmare, the reasonable course of action is for them to do so immediately.
Still, the national government of Spain, the World Health Organization and the European Union consider that Spain is more than ready to receive these patients and launch the appropriate public health response that is more prepared than Cabo Verde. At the same time, the World Health Organization is tracking 23 passengers that disembarked the ship in Santa Elena and are now being tracked to see where they are, and 80 other passengers that took a flight to South Africa with one of the passengers that later died.
Okay, Marta, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed on that story. We'll be keeping an eye out for any further developments, of course. But we're moving on now. The European Commission says it is upping its commitments to promoting the rights and inclusion of people with disabilities by reviewing its long-term strategy. Our Europe editor, Maria Tadeo, sat down with the EU's Commissioner for Equality, Hadja Labib, and started by asking her about the Commission's new initiatives.
We are launching a new EU alliance for independent living with sub-budget also to support service-based communities instead of institutions. And that is why what we call deinstitutionalization, to be sure that a person with disabilities can live their own life independently. And it is about their dignity, their choice also. And then to put everything into place to be sure that they will have the capacity to be more included in the labor market.
And I have to ask you, there's a very political question, but it matters because of the times that we're in. Some would argue there's been, pushback against the idea of inclusivity, that the political debate is sort of shifting into a form of right that is about power and might and looks at ideas of diversity, inclusivity. It is too woke. We don't want it. We don't like it anymore. Is that something that you're concerned about?
Yes, I'm concerned about because I'm Commissioner for Equality, and we see a regression when it comes to gender equality and all kind of, discrimination is something that we need to combat, because this is not the Europe we want to live in. We want a Europe that is forgetting no one, that is inclusive, that is diverse. This is our added value as a continent. So it's important to be very vocal, and that's why we had this strategy. We could have gone until 2030 without, creating new flagship, new communication. But we did exactly the contrary. It means that equality, values, principles matter in our Europe, and we are proud of.
At what time horizon do you look at? What is something that is acceptable to you to see a Europe that looks like more like your proposal than the current one that we have?
This is something that we should think about from yesterday, I would say, because it's linked to my other parts, my other competence, preparedness. We need to rebuild Ukraine, for instance, with having in mind the number of people who are wounded today. You know, I visited hospitals where you see a lot of people amputated, unfortunately. And we need to have accessibility by design to be sure that when we rebuild new schools, new hospitals, new airports, that it is accessible, you know, from the starting point and not something that as an added afterthought.
In this process, and I'm sure, as you said, you had many stories and you spoke to many different people. What did you learn personally out of this?
That it's about all of us, and it's about who we are and how we want to live. You know, if you want to live in a society where the most fragile, vulnerable are left behind, you can, you know, think that it could be you, it can be your mother, it can be your children, your child tomorrow. And so it creates a lot of anxiety and a lack of confidence also. And what we are doing, it's exactly the contrary. We are building a trustful society where you know that we care about you. We care about all of us.
We're moving on now. A crucial set of elections are taking place in the UK today. Voters in Wales and Scotland choose who runs their devolved governments, while many parts of England will elect local councils and mayors. The results are expected to provide a snapshot of the UK's fast-changing politics. Our Jakob Yanis has more.
Today, millions across the UK are heading to the polls. In parts of England, voters are electing local councils and several city mayors. And voters in Scotland and Wales are choosing who will lead their devolved governments. And while the EU has not been a prominent campaign topic, your reporter started to wonder, could these elections matter for the EU? In England, the traditional dominance of the Labour and Conservative parties is being challenged by two insurgent forces: Nigel Farage, Reform UK, and Zach Polanski, Green Party. With little experience in local infrastructure like bin collections or road repairs, their popularity was built on international issues: Brexit and immigration versus pro-EU stance, environmentalism and the conflict in Gaza. And amid growing unpopularity for Starmer's Labour government and low ratings for the Conservatives, parts of the public are seeking alternatives beyond the main parties. Moreover, predictions suggest Labour could lose nearly 3/4 of its local council seats, its historic dominance in Wales and popularity in Scotland. And while Starmer is not on the ballot paper, a weak show for Labour could add to his domestic issues and disrupt his diplomatic UK-EU reset. But here is a paradox. 10 years after Brexit referendum, recent surveys show that majority of all voters now support rejoining the EU, rising even to over 80% among Labour and Green supporters. Yet, at the same time, the pro-Brexit Reform UK party is enjoying a massive surge, arguing that Brexit was completely mismanaged. And some even say they could form the future national government. Alright, so even if these local elections are about fixing the potholes in the roads, Britons still seem to be unsure which road to take.
And that's it from us for today. And today's show was, in fact, our 100th episode. Thank you to you for keeping us company today and every morning here on Europe Today. Euronews' Maeve McMahon and Sasha Vakulina will be moderating sessions at the European Business Summit in Brussels later. You can catch that on our live stream on our social media channels. And we'll be back again with you at the same time tomorrow.
8:30, your daily time to understand Europe. Monday, deep dive conversations with business leaders. Tuesday, in-depth interview with Europe's most important personalities. Wednesday, two political heavyweights from across the EU face off.